The drill bit screamed through Sarah's bedroom wall at 3 a.m., raining plaster into her coffee cup. Outside, floodlights blazed like a football stadium, and men in hard hats pretended not to see her standing in her nightgown, holding a shotgun. You need to step back," the foreman called out, not even pausing the machinery. "This is legal now." But Sarah Chen had spent 15 years as a corporate lawyer before inheriting her grandfather's farm, and she knew exactly what legal meant. What they didn't know was that her property sat on something far more valuable than oil, and she was about to turn their million-dollar operation into their worst nightmare. The sound hit Sarah Chen like a physical blow, a mechanical roar that vibrated through the floorboards of her grandfather's farmhouse and straight into her bones. She bolted upright in bed, heart hammering, as the antique window panes rattled in their frames. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m. Throwing on her robe, she stumbled to the window and yanked back the curtains. Her breath caught. Where yesterday there had been nothing but the familiar silhouette of her grandfather's old oak grove, now blazed a constellation of industrial lights. Massive trucks lined her property, their diesel engines rumbling like sleeping dragons. And in the center of it all, a towering drilling rig clawed at the earth with mechanical fury. "What the hell?" Sarah grabbed her phone, fingers shaking as she dialed 911. 911, "What's your emergency?" "There are people drilling on my property without permission. I need police out here immediately." A pause. "What's your address?" Sarah rattled off the farm's location, her voice rising over the industrial cacophony outside. "They are trespassing. They are destroying my land. We'll send someone out, but if they have permits, they don't have my permission." Sarah hung up and pulled on jeans and boots, her movements sharp with fury. She'd inherited this land 6 months ago when her grandfather passed, leaving behind his corporate law practice in Chicago to honor his memory. The 200-acre farm in rural Pennsylvania had been in the Chen family for 3 generations. It was supposed to be her sanctuary. She stormed outside, the night air thick with diesel fumes and the acrid smell of disturbed earth. Workers in hard hats and reflective vests moved between the trucks like ants around a disrupted hill. The drilling rig towered 30 feet above her grandfather's oak trees, its bit grinding relentlessly into the ground. "Hey!" Sarah marched toward the nearest cluster of workers. "Hey!" A man in a white hard hat turned, clearly the foreman, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades in the oil fields. "You need to stay back from the work site. Safety regulations." "Safety regulations? This is my property." Sarah's voice cracked with rage. "You're trespassing." The foreman's expression didn't change. "No, we are not. We have all the necessary permits from Blackstone Energy Corporation." He pulled a folded document from his breast pocket. "Drilling rights were legally obtained." Sarah snatched the paper, scanning it under the harsh work lights. Her legal training kicked in automatically, parsing the dense legalese. "This says..." Her blood turned to ice. "This says my grandfather signed over drilling rights to his property." "That's correct. Signed and notarized 6 months ago." The foreman's tone was professionally polite, which somehow made it worse. "We tried to contact you multiple times about the start date." "Certified mail." "I never received any." Sarah stopped. 6 months ago. Right when she'd been drowning in probate paperwork, living out of hotels while settling her grandfather's estate. Mail had been forwarded and re-forwarded, half of it lost in the bureaucratic shuffle. "Look, lady, I understand this is inconvenient, but we've got a schedule to keep." The foreman gestured toward the rig. "We'll be done in 6 to 8 weeks, and your compensation check is already processing." "Compensation?" Sarah's voice was deadly quiet. "What compensation?" "The lease agreement. $40,000 for drilling rights, plus royalties on any oil we find." He consulted his clipboard. "Pretty standard rate for this area. $40,000. For the land her great-grandfather had bought with his life savings after immigrating from China. For the oak grove where her grandfather had taught her to identify bird songs. For the meadow where she'd planned to build a sustainable farm, maybe. Start the family she'd never had time for in her corporate life. I want to see the original contract, Sarah said. The foreman shrugged. You'll have to contact Blackstone for that. We are just the drilling crew. Red and blue lights flashed through the darkness as a police cruiser turned up the gravel drive. Sarah felt a surge of relief. Finally, someone with authority who could stop this insanity. Officer Martinez stepped out of the patrol car, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He was young, probably new to the force, and his uniform was perfectly pressed despite the 3 a.m. call. You reported trespassing. Yes. They are drilling on my property without permission. Officer Martinez looked from Sarah to the foreman, who held up the drilling permit with the patient air of someone who'd been through this before. Sir, could I see your documentation? The foreman handed over a thick folder. Officer Martinez reviewed it with a flashlight, his face professionally neutral. After several long minutes, he looked up. They appear to have valid permits. The drilling rights were legally transferred by my grandfather, who was, Sarah stopped herself. Her grandfather had been sharp as a tack until the day he died. No early-stage dementia, no cognitive decline. But 6 months ago, he'd been dealing with his terminal cancer diagnosis. He'd been on heavy pain medications. He'd been desperate to ensure she'd have money after he was gone. Officer Martinez prompted gently. This is wrong, Sarah said, but the fight was draining out of her voice. There has to be some mistake. I'm sorry, but if the permits are valid, there's nothing I can do. You'll need to handle this through civil court if you want to dispute the contract. Officer Martinez's tone was sympathetic but final. I'd recommend contacting a lawyer. Sarah almost laughed. She was a lawyer. Or had been, before she'd walked away from her partnership at Morrison, Hayes and Associates to honor her grandfather's memory by working the land he'd loved. The officer left. The foreman went back to supervising the drilling. And Sarah stood alone in her nightgown and boots, watching strangers tear apart her family's legacy for $40,000 and whatever oil they might find beneath the oak grove her great-grandfather had planted with his own hands. The drilling rig shrieked against stone, and Sarah felt something inside her chest crack like a fault line. She'd spent 15 years in corporate law, specializing in contract disputes and mineral rights. She'd negotiated billion-dollar deals and dismantled fraudulent schemes that had destroyed entire communities. She'd also made a lot of enemies. But this was different. This was personal. And as she watched the drill bit chew through the earth where her grandfather used to sit and feed the birds every morning, Sarah Chen began to smile. She pulled out her phone and started making calls. First to a former law firm's private investigator. Then to the Geological Survey Office. Then to a contact at the State Environmental Agency who owed her a very large favor from a case she'd helped him with 3 years ago. Because Blackstone Energy Corporation had made 2 critical mistakes. First, they'd assumed that a grieving granddaughter would be too overwhelmed by loss and legal paperwork to fight back effectively. Second, they'd never bothered to research exactly who Sarah Chen was or why she'd really left corporate law. By sunrise, she'd know everything there was to know about Blackstone Energy Corporation, their drilling operation, and every single permit they claimed to hold. And by sunset, she'd know exactly how to destroy them. The drill bit hit bedrock with a sound like breaking bones, and Sarah's smile turned predatory. They had no idea what they'd just awakened. Sarah's fingers flew across her laptop keyboard as dawn crept over the drilling site. She'd barricaded herself in her grandfather's study, surrounded by towers of legal documents, empty coffee cups, and the ghosts of 1,000 corporate battles. The drilling rig's relentless hammering provided a soundtrack of fury that kept her wired and focused. Her phone buzzed. Marcus Rivera, the private investigator who'd helped her destroy 3 Fortune 500 companies during her corporate years. Sarah. Christ, I haven't heard from you since you went full hermit farmer. What's so urgent it couldn't wait until business hours? Blackstone Energy Corporation. I need everything. Financials, permits, executive backgrounds, environmental violations, parking tickets. Everything. She paused as the drill bit hit something that made the entire rig shudder. And I need it in 6 hours. A low whistle. That's not much time. What did they do to piss off the Ice Queen? Sarah's old nickname from her corporate days. She'd earned it by systematically dismantling opposing counsel with the emotional warmth of an Arctic wind. They're drilling on my family's land. Without proper consent. Ah. Someone's about to learn why you retired undefeated. Marcus's voice turned serious. I'll have preliminary findings by noon. Full workup by evening. Next call, Dr. Elena Vasquez, at the Pennsylvania Geological Survey. Sarah, I was wondering when you'd surface again. Heard you were playing farmer these days. Elena, I need a favor. Can you pull geological surveys for coordinates? Sarah rattled off her property location. Specifically anything filed in the last year. Mineral rights assessments, environmental, impact studies, the works. Sure, but that might take 6 hours. Please. Sarah's voice carried the steel that had once made oil executives weep in depositions. This is important. A pause. Jesus, you sound like you're back in war mode. What's happening out there? Through the window, Sarah watched a convoy of tanker trucks rumble past her grandmother's rose garden, leaving deep ruts in the manicured lawn. I'm about to find out. The third call went to David Kim at the State Environmental Protection Agency. She'd saved his career 3 years ago when he'd blown the whistle on illegal dumping by a chemical giant. The company had tried to destroy him. Sarah had destroyed the company instead. Sarah Chen. I should have known you'd surface eventually. David's voice was warm with genuine affection. What can I do for you? Blackstone Energy Corporation. Any environmental violations, pending investigations, complaints? That's specific. Any particular reason? They're drilling on my property, and something feels wrong. Very wrong. Give me 2 hours. I'll call you back. By 10 a.m., Sarah had preliminary findings that made her blood sing with predatory satisfaction. Blackstone Energy wasn't just another drilling company. They were cowboys, cutting corners, and buying silence with strategically placed donations to local politicians. 3 environmental violations in the past 2 years, all quietly settled out of court. A pattern of targeting elderly landowners during medical crises, presenting complex contracts that buried the real terms in legal jargon. But that was just the appetizer. The main course arrived when Marcus called back at noon. Sarah, you're going to love this. Blackstone Energy is hemorrhaging money. They've leveraged themselves to the hilt on this Pennsylvania operation. It's make or break for the entire company. How make or break? Chapter 11 bankruptcy if this drilling operation doesn't pay off big. And here's the kicker, they're geological. Surveys are bullshit. Sarah sat up straighter. Explain. They filed impact assessments claiming minimal environmental disruption to secure their permits. But I dug up the real surveys they commissioned privately. Your property sits on top of an underground watershed that feeds 3 counties. 1 major spill, and they're looking at environmental lawsuits that would make the Exxon Valdez look like a parking ticket. Through the window, Sarah watched workers attaching a massive storage tank to the drilling apparatus. Her grandfather's oak trees were already dying, their leaves yellowing from the contaminated runoff. There's more, Marcus continued. The company president, Richard Blackstone, has been quietly liquidating personal assets for the past 6 months. Houses, boats, art collection, everything's being sold. Either he's planning to run, or he's desperate to keep the company afloat. Send me everything, Sarah said. And Marcus? Start digging into the contract my grandfather signed. Something isn't right about the timing. Elena called at 2 p.m. with news that made Sarah's heart race. Your property's geological profile is fascinating. The surface mineral rights are standard, small oil deposits, nothing spectacular. But there's something much more interesting underneath. Which is rare earth elements. Specifically, lithium deposits that weren't fully mapped until a federal survey last month. We are talking potentially hundreds of millions in value, especially with the electric vehicle boom. Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place. Did Blackstone Energy have access to those federal surveys? Not officially, but Richard Blackstone's brother-in-law sits on the Geological Survey Board. Technically, it would be illegal for him to share that information before public release. When does it go public? Next month. Perfect. Blackstone Energy was gambling everything on a secret that wouldn't be secret much longer. They'd manipulated a dying old man into signing away rights to deposits worth a fortune, banking on the fact that his granddaughter wouldn't realize what she'd inherited until it was too late. David Kim's call came at 4 p.m. and confirmed Sarah's darkest suspicions. Blackstone Energy has been flying under the radar, but they've got serious problems. I found complaint filings from 3 other drilling sites, all groundwater contamination, all settled with NDAs and cash payments. They're not just cutting corners, Sarah. They're environmental criminals. Any ongoing investigations? Nothing official. But if someone were to file a formal complaint with documented evidence? David's voice trailed off meaningfully. Hypothetically speaking, of course. Of course. Sarah hung up and walked to her grandfather's gun cabinet. The old Remington 870 shotgun was still there, cleaned and ready. Her grandfather had taught her to shoot when she was 12, peppering tin cans in the back pasture while lecturing her about standing up to bullies. The law is a tool, little bird, he'd said, using his pet name for her. But sometimes you need different tools. She loaded the shotgun and stepped outside. The evening shift was setting up floodlights, preparing for another night of round-the-clock drilling. The foreman, Jenkins, according to his name tag, was barking orders at a crew positioning a chemical storage tank dangerously close to the old well her great-grandfather had dug by hand. Jenkins. Sarah called out, the shotgun cradled casually in her arms. He turned, his face going pale when he saw the weapon. I'm going to have to ask you to relax. It's not loaded. Sarah smiled, and several workers took involuntary steps backward. I just wanted to chat. Jenkins motioned for his crew to continue working, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. What about? You know what you're drilling through, don't you? The underground watershed. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you don't. Just like you don't know about the lithium deposits, or the environmental violations at your last 3 sites, or the fact that your company is about to file for bankruptcy. Sarah's voice was conversational, almost friendly. Amazing how much a person can learn in one day when they know where to look. Jenkins's face had gone from pale to grey. I just run the drilling crew, lady. I don't know anything about corporate. No, but you know about groundwater contamination. You know that storage tank is positioned directly over the main aquifer feed. And you know that if there's a spill, 3 counties lose their drinking water. The positioning is within legal parameters. Legal and safe are different things. Jenkins, you and I both know that. Sarah took a step closer, and the foreman instinctively backed away. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Look, I've got a job to do here. So do I. Sarah turned and walked back toward the house, leaving Jenkins staring after her with the expression of a man who just realized he was standing in quicksand. Her phone was ringing when she got inside. Marcus again. Sarah, you need to hear this. I found the notary who handled your grandfather's contract. And Thomas Chen never signed it. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. What? The notary, Patricia Hoffman, she's scared shitless. Says she was paid $5,000 to notarize a signature she never witnessed. Says the old man wasn't even there, just some corporate lawyer with a forged signature and a sob story about a dying client who couldn't travel. Sarah sank into her grandfather's desk chair, the shotgun across her lap. They forged his signature. It gets better. Hoffman kept copies of everything, photos, documents, even a recording of the conversation where the lawyer told her exactly what to write in her notary log. She's been waiting 6 months for someone to come asking questions. Why didn't she report it? Because Richard Blackstone's nephew is the county prosecutor, and she was afraid of retaliation. But if someone with serious legal firepower were to get involved? Sarah looked out the window at the drilling rig, at the poisoned earthware her grandfather used to feed the birds, at the corporate machinery grinding her families. Sarah's first call went to Judge Catherine Morrison, her former law firm's namesake partner and the woman who taught her that the law was a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Sarah Chen. I wondered when you'd resurface. Judge Morrison's voice carried the warmth of genuine affection mixed with wariness. Please tell me you're not calling because someone's stupid enough to pick a fight with you. They forged my grandfather's signature on a mineral rights contract. Then they started drilling on my land at 3 a.m. without proper environmental clearances. Sarah's voice was ice-cold professional. I need an emergency injunction. A long pause. Jesus, Sarah. What aren't you telling me? Blackstone Energy Corporation is drilling on top of an underground watershed that supplies drinking water to 3 counties. They've positioned chemical storage tanks directly over the aquifer feed. And they are about to hit lithium deposits worth hundreds of millions that they acquired through fraud. And you discovered all this how? The same way. I always discover things. By being very thorough and very motivated. Sarah looked out the window at the floodlights blazing over her dying oak grove. Catherine, they killed my grandfather's trees. The ones his father planted when he immigrated here. That grove is 3 generations of my family's history. Ah. Now I understand why you sound like you're planning to burn down half of Pennsylvania. Judge Morrison's tone turned serious. What do you need? Emergency environmental protection order. Full work stoppage pending investigation. And I need it in 12 hours. Sarah, even if I grant the injunction, they'll appeal it immediately. You'll buy yourself maybe a week before. A week is all I need. Another pause. What are you planning? To remind corporate America why I retired undefeated. At 6 a.m., Sarah drove into town to meet Patricia Hoffman, the notary who'd been bribed to falsify her grandfather's signature. The woman was waiting in a diner parking lot, chain-smoking and looking like she hadn't slept in months. Miss Chen. Patricia's voice shook as she approached Sarah's truck. Oh. I'm sorry about your grandfather. I never wanted to, I know. Sarah's tone was gentler than Patricia expected. You were threatened. It's not your fault. I kept everything. Photos, recordings, copies of all the documents. I knew this day would come. Patricia handed over a flash drive with trembling fingers. That corporate lawyer, he said your grandfather was dying and couldn't travel to sign the papers. Said it was a mercy, helping an old man secure his granddaughter's future. What was the lawyer's name? James Blackstone. Richard Blackstone's son. Sarah smiled and Patricia took an involuntary step back. She'd heard about Sarah Chen's reputation in legal circles. The ice queen who'd destroyed companies with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a shark. Patricia, I'm going to need you to testify. In court, under oath. They'll destroy me. Richard Blackstone owns half the county officials. No, Sarah said quietly. I'm going to destroy them. You're going to help me do it. And when it's over, you'll be protected by federal whistleblower statutes and have enough reward money to start over anywhere you want. By 8 a.m., Sarah was back at the farm, loading her grandfather's old Ford pickup with supplies, surveying equipment, soil sample containers, a high-end camera, and the shotgun. Just in case. The drilling crew was changing shifts, exhausted night. Workers heading home while the day crew fired up equipment that should have been silent pending the environmental review that Blackstone had clearly bypassed. Sarah parked at the edge of the work site and started taking photographs. Every truck, every piece of equipment, every worker's face. When Jenkins approached, she switched to video mode. You can't be here during active operations. Actually, I can. This is still my property. Sarah kept filming. Tell me, Jenkins, when was the last environmental impact assessment done on this site? That's not my department, no, but you know the regulations. You know that drilling operations of this scale require updated environmental clearances. Every 6 months. When was yours last updated? Jenkins's face went grey. Look, lady, I just run the equipment. Your equipment is positioned directly over the main aquifer feed for 3 counties. One chemical spill and you're looking at environmental disaster on a scale that would make national news. Sarah lowered the camera, her voice deadly quiet. How's your family's drinking water, Jenkins? You live in Millerville, right? That's fed by this same watershed. How do you know where I live? I know lots of things. I know your company cut corners on the environmental surveys. I know they are operating on forged contracts. And I know that when the EPA shows up here this afternoon, they're going to shut you down so hard your grandchildren will feel it. Jenkins stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked back to his crew. Within minutes, Sarah watched him making frantic phone calls. Her own phone rang at 10 a.m. Richard Blackstone himself. Miss Chen. This is Richard Blackstone, president of Blackstone Energy. I understand there's been some confusion about our drilling operation. No confusion at all, Mr. Blackstone. I understand perfectly that your son committed fraud by forging my grandfather's signature and you're drilling on stolen land. A long pause. I think there's been some misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding was on your part when you assumed I'd be too grief-stricken to fight back. Thomas Chen never signed your contract. Your son bribed a notary to forge his signature. And now you're about to lose everything. Miss Chen, I'm sure we can reach some accommodation. Perhaps we could discuss increasing your compensation. I don't want money, Mr. Blackstone. I want you gone. Permanently. I'm afraid that's not possible. We have legally binding contracts and valid permits. No, you have fraudulent documents and bribed officials. There's a difference. Sarah hung up and immediately called David Kim at the EPA. David, I'm sending you a treasure trove of evidence. Forged contracts, bribed officials, environmental violations, and illegal drilling operations. How fast can you get investigators to my property? With evidence this solid? 3 hours. Perfect. And David, bring cameras. This is going to be the kind of case that makes careers. At noon, Judge Morrison called back. Your emergency injunction is granted. All drilling operations must cease immediately pending full environmental and legal review. Local sheriff should be serving the order within the hour. Thank you, Catherine. Sarah. Be careful. Men like Richard Blackstone don't give up easily. They tend to get dangerous when they are cornered. As if summoned by the warning, a convoy of black SUVs turned up Sarah's driveway. She watched from the window as a small army of men in expensive suits deployed around the drilling site, clearly corporate security. Richard Blackstone emerged from the lead vehicle, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of predatory elegance that came from decades of crushing smaller opponents. He was flanked by lawyers and what looked like private military contractors. Sarah walked outside, the shotgun cradled casually in her arms. Miss Chen. Blackstone's voice carried the smooth menace of a man accustomed to intimidating people. I think we need to talk. About what? About being reasonable. About not making enemies of people who have long memories and deep pockets. Sarah's smile was arctic. Is that a threat, Mr. Blackstone? It's a reality check. You're one woman on a farm in the middle of nowhere. I own judges, prosecutors, and half the state legislature. You cannot win this fight. Watch me. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension. Sheriff's deputies, EPA investigators, and federal marshals converged on the property like an advancing army. Sarah had called in every favor, contacted every ally, and activated every network she'd built during 15 years of corporate warfare. Richard Blackstone. The lead EPA investigator stepped forward with a badge and a warrant. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, environmental crimes, and violation of federal water protection statutes. Blackstone's face went pale as the handcuffs clicked shut. This is harassment. I'll have your badge, actually, Sarah said pleasantly. You won't. Because in about 6 hours, when the federal prosecutors finish reviewing the evidence, you'll be too busy trying to avoid spending the rest of your life in federal prison. As Blackstone was loaded into a federal marshal's vehicle, Sarah turned to Jenkins and his crew, who were standing frozen beside their suddenly silent drilling rig. Gentlemen, I'd suggest you start looking for new jobs. Blackstone Energy Corporation just became a crime scene. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, Blackstone's assets frozen by federal order. Company stock in free fall. You magnificent, terrifying woman. Sarah looked out over her property, at the drilling rig that would be dismantled, at the poisoned earth that would be restored, at the oak grove that might yet recover from this violation. But as the last of the federal vehicles disappeared down her driveway, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Not all of Blackstone's security team had left with him. 2 men in tactical gear were still moving through the tree line at the edge of her. Sarah's military training kicked in before her conscious mind fully processed the threat. 15 years of corporate law had honed her mind, but her body remembered the 2 years she'd spent in Army intelligence before law school, the hypervigilance, the tactical awareness, the ability to read terrain and threats like a survival manual. She slipped back into the house, locked the doors, and grabbed her grandfather's hunting rifle from the gun cabinet. Through the kitchen window, she tracked the 2 figures moving through the oak grove with professional precision. Not random thugs. These were contractors, probably ex-military, definitely dangerous. Her phone had no signal. They jammed it. Sarah moved to her grandfather's old radio setup in the basement. He'd been a ham radio operator, and the equipment was still functional. She tried to raise the sheriff's department, but got only static. They were jamming everything. The sound of breaking glass upstairs made her freeze. They were inside. Sarah killed the basement lights and moved silently to her grandfather's workbench, where he'd kept his collection of antique tools. She selected a heavy wrench and positioned herself behind the furnace, controlling the only exit from the basement. Footsteps above. Measured, careful, professional. They were searching room by room. Chen. A voice called out, deep, gravelly, with a slight southern accent. We just want to talk. Sarah almost laughed. Men who wanted to talk didn't break into houses and jam communications. We know you're here, Ms. Chen. Mr. Blackstone made you a generous offer. You should have taken it. More footsteps. They were moving toward the basement door. Sarah's mind raced through her options. The basement had 2 exits, the main stairs they were approaching, and the old coal chute that led to the backyard. The chute was narrow, barely wide enough for a person, but it opened near the old well where she'd have cover. The basement door creaked open. A flashlight beam swept down the stairs. Ms. Chen, we are coming down. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Sarah belly crawled toward the coal chute, moving with the silent precision her drill sergeant had beaten into her 20 years ago. The chute door was rusted shut, but a few careful strikes with the wrench broke it free. She squeezed through just as the first contractor reached the bottom of the stairs. She's not down here. Check outside. She can't have gone far. Sarah emerged from the coal chute behind the well house, her grandfather's rifle clutched in. Muddy hands. The contractors were professionals, but they'd made a critical error. They assumed they were hunting a corporate lawyer-turned-farmer, not someone who'd spent 2 years training with Army Rangers before discovering she had a gift for destroying people with paperwork instead of bullets. She circled wide through the tree line, using shadows and terrain the way her grandfather had taught her to track deer. The contractors had split up, one checking the barn while the other swept the perimeter. Sarah chose the barn. She climbed the old maple tree behind the structure, positioning herself with a clear view through the loft. Window. The contractor below moved methodically, checking every stall, every piece of equipment. When he reached the center of the barn, directly below her position, Sarah dropped through the loft opening. She landed on him like a falling anvil, driving her knee into his solar plexus and sending him crashing into a pile of feed sacks. The rifle flew from his hands, skittering across the barn floor. Who sent you? Sarah pressed the barrel of her grandfather's hunting rifle against the man's neck. Go. Go to hell, he gasped. Wrong answer. Sarah pulled back the bolt, chambering around with a sound that every hunter knew meant business. I spent 2 years in Army intelligence before I became a lawyer. I know 17 different ways to make you talk, and 12 of them don't leave permanent damage. Your choice. The man's eyes widened. He hadn't expected this level of competence from a woman he'd been told was just a grieving granddaughter. Blackstone. Blackstone hired us through a shell company. Said you were threatening his family. With what? Legal action. Fraud charges. He said you'd fabricated evidence and needed to be discouraged. Sarah's smile was winter cold. And you believed him. $20,000 up front. 20 more when the job was done. What job? The man hesitated, and Sarah pressed the rifle barrel harder against his throat. Scare you off. Make you drop the charges. If that didn't work. He swallowed. Hard. Make you disappear. How many others? Just me and Garcia. But if we don't check in every hour? More come looking. Sarah nodded. Where's Garcia now? Checking the house. Probably wondering where I went. Sarah zip-tied the contractor's hands with cable ties from her grandfather's workbench, then gagged him with a feed sack. She needed to deal with Garcia before backup arrived. She approached the house from the blind side, using the old root cellar as cover. Through the kitchen window, she could see Garcia ransacking her grandfather's study, looking for something specific. The federal evidence. He was trying to destroy the files that would bury Blackstone Energy Corporation. Sarah's rage flared white-hot. They'd invaded her home, threatened her life, and now they were trying to destroy the justice she'd built for her grandfather's memory. She entered through the front door, moving with lethal silence through the house she'd known since childhood. Garcia was in the study, feeding documents into a portable shredder. Stop! Garcia spun, reaching for his sidearm, but Sarah was ready. She put 3 rounds from the hunting rifle into the wall beside his head, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The next one goes through your knee, then your shoulder. Then we see how long it takes you to bleed out while telling me everything you know about who sent you. Garcia raised his hands, his face pale. Lady, you don't understand the kind of people you're messing with. No, you don't understand. Sarah's voice was deadly calm. I spent 15 years destroying corporations and the people who ran them. I've put executives in federal prison, bankrupted companies, and ended careers with a phone call and the right paperwork. Richard Blackstone thinks he can intimidate me with hired thugs. She pulled out her phone, which had mysteriously regained signal now that Garcia's jamming equipment was no longer active. Detective Morrison. Sarah Chen. I have 2 armed men who broke into my home and threatened me. Yes, I'm holding them at gunpoint. No, I don't need backup. They're not going anywhere. 20 minutes later, the property was swarming with law enforcement again. The contractors were arrested, their equipment confiscated, and their employer traced back to a shell company owned by Richard Blackstone's nephew. But as Sarah watched the police cars disappear down her driveway, she felt a cold certainty settling in her bones. This wasn't over. Blackstone might be in federal custody, but he still had resources, connections, and the kind of desperate fury that came from watching a lifetime of accumulated power collapse in a single day. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Ms. Chen. The voice was cultured, professional, with just a hint of accent she couldn't place. My name is Victor Kozlov. I represent certain interests that have been inconvenienced by your recent actions. Let me guess. Blackstone Energy's investors. Among others. You've created significant financial exposure for several international organizations. This has made certain people very unhappy. I don't care. Perhaps you should. We are not constrained by American law enforcement, Ms. Chen. We have resources that make Richard Blackstone look like a small-town businessman. Sarah walked to her grandfather's gun cabinet and began loading a second rifle. Is that a threat? It's a business proposition. Walk away from this. Drop the charges. Accept a very generous settlement. And live to enjoy your grandfather's farm. In peace. And if I refuse, then we stop being polite. The line went dead. Sarah stood alone in her grandfather's house, surrounded by the detritus of the day's battles, broken glass, scattered papers, the lingering smell of gun smoke. Outside, the drilling rig stood silent like a mechanical monument to corporate greed and personal violation. She'd won the day, but the war was escalating beyond anything she'd imagined. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Check. Your email. We thought you should see what's coming. The attached video made her blood freeze. Satellite footage of her property, taken in real time. Professional surveillance photos of her at the diner that morning, at the courthouse, arriving home. And at the end, night vision footage of armed figures moving through the woods around her house. Not 2 men this time. A dozen. They were coming. Tonight, and this time they weren't planning to take prisoners. Sarah stared at the surveillance footage for exactly 30 seconds before her survival instincts took over. 12 armed professionals against 1 woman on an isolated farm. Those weren't odds you fought. Those were odds you changed. She grabbed her grandfather's military surplus radio and tuned to the emergency frequency. Mayday, Mayday. This is Sarah Chen at 1247 County Road 18. I have credible intelligence of an imminent armed assault on my property by international criminal elements, requesting immediate federal assistance. The response came faster than she'd expected. Ms. Chen, this is Agent Rebecca Torres, FBI. We've been monitoring your situation since the EPA arrests. Are you in immediate danger? Negative, but I have surveillance footage showing 12 armed hostiles positioning around my property. They'll move after dark. Can you evacuate? Sarah looked around her grandfather's house, at the photographs of 3 generations of her family, at the hand-carved furniture her great-grandfather had made during his first winter in America, at the quilts her grandmother had sewn while waiting for her husband to return from Korea. No, this is my land. They don't get to drive me away. A pause. Ms. Chen, we have tactical teams en route, but they're 40 minutes out. Can you hold your position that long? Agent Torres, I spent 2 years in Army intelligence and 15 years destroying people who thought they were untouchable. 12 mercenaries against one very angry lawyer with home field advantage. Sarah's smile was razor-sharp. They have no idea what they're walking into. Sarah moved through the house like a woman preparing for siege warfare, which is exactly what she was doing. She disabled every light bulb except those she wanted working, creating pools of darkness and strategic blind spots. She positioned motion sensors and hunting cameras at every approach route, and she armed herself with enough firepower to hold off a small army. Her grandfather hadn't just been a farmer and radio operator. Thomas Chen had been a combat engineer in Korea, and he'd taught his granddaughter that sometimes the best defense was turning your enemy's strength against them. The old barn held secrets that would have surprised the EPA investigators, a cache of military surplus equipment that her grandfather had acquired over the decades. Night vision goggles, tactical gear, and enough explosives to level a small building. Sarah rigged the drilling rig with thermite charges on a remote detonator. If she was going down, she was taking Blackstone's $1 million equipment with her. Her phone rang at sunset. Victor Kozlov again. Ms. Chen, you have one final opportunity to be reasonable. I'm listening. My employers are prepared to offer you $50 million to disappear, new identity, relocation anywhere in the world, and enough money to never work again. $50 million. Sarah almost laughed. Your bosses really don't understand what this is about, do they? Enlighten me. This was never about money. This is about justice for a dying old man who trusted the wrong people. This is about 3 generations of my family's blood and sweat that your employers tried to steal with forged signatures and bribed officials. Sentiment is expensive, Ms. Chen. Not as expensive as underestimating a woman who has nothing left to lose. Sarah hung up and settled into her grandfather's old sniper hide in the barn loft, a position he'd built during his paranoid years, complete with overlapping fields of fire and escape routes. At 9 p.m., they came. Sarah watched through night vision as 12 figures moved through the tree line with military precision. Professional kit, coordinated movements, suppressed weapons. These weren't corporate security guards. These were legitimate killers. They thought they were hunting a lawyer hiding in a farmhouse. They were wrong on both counts. Sarah waited until they were committed to their approach routes, then triggered the first surprise. Floodlights blazed to life around the drilling rig, temporarily blinding the team positioned there. In the confusion, she put 3 rounds through the rig's main hydraulic lines, sending high-pressure fluid spraying across the worksite. Contact. She's armed and prepared. The team leader's voice crackled through their communications, which Sarah was monitoring on her grandfather's scanner. Where is she? Unknown. Thermal imaging shows multiple heat signatures. She's got decoys running. Her grandfather's heating system modifications were paying off. Radiant tubing throughout the house created false thermal signatures, making it impossible to pinpoint her actual position. The mercenaries adapted quickly, splitting into 3 teams to assault the house from multiple angles. But Sarah had spent the afternoon turning her childhood home into a fortress. The team hitting the front door triggered the first booby trap, a modified deer feeder that dumped 50 pounds of ball bearings down the front steps at ankle-breaking velocity. 2 men went down hard. The back door team fared worse. Sarah had rigged her grandmother's old rose garden with motion sensors and sprinkler heads filled with military-grade pepper spray. Their tactical gear included gas masks, but the surprise and temporary blindness gave Sarah the opening she needed. She put 4 rounds through the kitchen window, forcing them back into the garden where more sprinklers activated. "This is insane," someone screamed over the radio. "She's turned the whole property into a kill zone." The third team tried to breach through the basement coal chute, the same route Sarah had used to escape earlier. But she'd anticipated that, and the narrow passage was now rigged with claymore mines on motion triggers. The explosion lit up the night sky and sent the remaining assault team scrambling for cover. "Fall back. Fall back. This is a professional defensive position." But Sarah wasn't done. She'd spent the afternoon studying their approach routes, and she knew exactly where they'd retreat to regroup. The old grain silo. Sarah triggered the thermite charges on the drilling rig, turning Blackstone's equipment into a pillar of molten metal and flame that could be seen for miles. Then she activated her grandfather's final surprise, a remote-controlled tractor loaded with the last of his explosive supplies. The unmanned John Deere rolled across the pasture like a mechanical angel of death, heading straight for the grain silo where the mercenaries had taken cover. "What the hell is that?" "It's a tractor. Why is there a OT?" The explosion vaporized the silo and sent a mushroom cloud into the night sky that definitely wasn't regulation fireworks. Sarah's radio crackled with Agent Torres's voice. "Ms. Chen, we are seeing some very interesting pyrotechnics from your position. Status report. 12 hostiles reduced to 6. The survivors are currently reconsidering their career choices. Are you injured?" "Negative. But I think I'm out of big explosions." "Hold position. We are 2 minutes out." Sarah climbed down from the barn loft and walked across her devastated property. The drilling rig was a twisted sculpture of cooling metal. The grain silo was a crater, and 6 very expensive mercenaries were face down in a pasture with their hands zip-tied behind their backs, having decided that surrender was preferable to facing whatever other surprises the crazy lawyer lady had rigged up. FBI tactical teams swarmed the property like vengeful angels, securing prisoners and evidence with professional efficiency. Agent Torres turned out to be a compact woman with silver hair and the kind of steady eyes that came from years of dealing with international criminals. "Ms. Chen, you've just handed us the biggest foreign conspiracy case of the year. These men are wanted by Interpol for everything from arms trafficking to political assassination." "What about their employers?" "Already under investigation. Your little war tonight gave us probable cause to freeze assets and make arrests across 3 continents." Sarah looked around at the smoking ruins of her grandfather's farm. The house was intact, but everything else looked like a battlefield. "Agent Torres, I need to ask you something." "Yes." "When this is all over, when the trials are finished and the criminals are in prison, will my grandfather's land be safe?" Agent Torres smiled. "Ms. Chen, after tonight, I think international criminals will add your property to their do not visit list, right next to Chernobyl and active volcanoes." 3 months later, Sarah stood in the same spot, watching construction crews plant new oak trees where the drilling rig had been. The lithium deposits were still there, but now they belonged to a conservation trust that would never allow them to be extracted. Richard Blackstone was serving 25 to life in federal prison. His company had been liquidated, with proceeds going to environmental restoration. Viktor Kozlov and his employers were facing an international tribunal for conspiracy, murder, and about 50 other charges that would keep them busy for the rest of their lives. And Sarah Chen had returned to farming, with one significant addition to her grandfather's old setup, a state-of-the-art security system installed by very grateful federal agents who wanted to make sure their star witness stayed healthy. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, saw the news about the Blackstone sentencing. "How does it feel to be the woman who took down an international criminal conspiracy with a deer feeder and some ball bearings?" Sarah smiled and typed back, "Like my grandfather would be proud." She looked out over the restored land, where new oak trees were already putting down roots in soil that would never again be violated by corporate greed and criminal ambition. They'd tried to steal her family's legacy. Instead, they'd learned why some pay